interesting. Sounds rather sort of bizarre, but I did go to Diana's coffin the day after I'd written it.
For 28 years, Earl Spencer never said a single word about Meghan or Harry. But Meghan and Harry just did something reckless that finally got him very furious. They sent him a proposal begging for approval to use Diana's story, her legacy. Spencer was having none of it. He called it a shameless act from a son who should know better. So what exactly did Harry and Meghan ask for? What pushed them this desperate? The answer is far uglier than anyone ever imagined. The confrontation that broke. 28 years of silence. The night before the most watched funeral the world had ever seen, a man walked alone into a quiet room where Diana's body lay inside a closed coffin. He pulled a single folded piece of paper from his pocket and read every word of it out loud to her before a single soul outside that room ever heard one syllable of it. But that paper was not a simple eulogy. It was a personal vow sealed directly to her before the world got any piece of it at all. That man was Earl Charles Spencer. And for 28 straight years afterward, he never once broke that vow. Music, people close to him at the time later, said he had barely slept the week leading up to the funeral, rewriting the same lines over and over, terrified of getting it wrong in front of a family that rarely showed feeling in public. Then fast forward to the day everything finally cracked open. A proposal reached Spencer's desk carrying his own nephew's name stamped right across it, and it did not arrive in some quiet moment alone. It landed at midday in the estate office at Alworth, while his estate manager and 2 members of his household staff were still standing in the room finishing other business. The room went completely silent when Spencer opened it and read the first page, because everyone present watched his face change before he said a single word. Spencer slowly set the pages down and spoke in a voice colder than anything his own staff had ever heard from him. He said he had expected better timing than to be insulted on a day he had planned to spend doing something worthwhile. Then Spencer let Meghan and Harry have it. And once he started, he refused to stop. He kept reading, and his temper only grew sharper until he fired off the first blow straight at the page in front of him. Is this a joke or something? This reads like 2 people trying to convince a bank they still have savings when the account has already run completely dry. Spencer turned the page before he landed the second blow, sharper than the first. They built their entire lives waiting for applause that stopped coming years ago. And it took the ratings this long just to catch up and say it out loud. The staff in that room stood frozen, watching a man who almost never raised his voice tear apart 2 people without even rising from his chair. One of them later admitted he had never once seen Spencer show that much feeling about anything, not even at his own sister's funeral, where he had stood rigid and composed in front of the entire world. When another staff member was asked why nobody in that room said a word to stop him, they simply said nobody felt they had the right to interrupt a man finally saying out loud what he had clearly been holding back for years. Spencer then went quiet, and somehow that silence landed harder than the anger had. What came out of his mouth next was the line his own staff later admitted actually shook them. Meghan's team had to manufacture a fresh scandal every few months just to keep anyone watching at all. A marriage that needs a brand new crisis every quarter to stay interesting isn't a love story. It's a release schedule. And then came the final blow, aimed straight at the one thing they had always believed would protect them no matter what happened. The only reason anyone still pretends to care is the name they married into. The day the world stops caring about that name, the 2 of them vanish completely. And from where I'm sitting that day, already looks a lot closer than they think. Spencer finished as quickly as he had started, signed nothing, and had the proposal sent straight back the way it came. By that evening, word of exactly what happened inside that room had already escaped Alworth on its own, carried by people who were never supposed to repeat a single word of it. Within a day, music, the story had reached London, and within a week, it had reached the production offices that had drafted the proposal in the first place, turning a private rejection into a public embarrassment nobody on that side of the family had budgeted for. Some inside those offices reportedly tried to keep the details from reaching Harry directly, hoping to control how the story music eventually got back to him. But the plan fell apart almost as fast as it was made. So why would a man who had stayed silent for almost 3 decades suddenly explode like that over one piece of paper? To answer that, you had to go all the way back to the funeral that made him famous in the first place. Because the man sitting in that estate office was never just reacting to a bad pitch. He was finishing a promise he made decades earlier inside a packed cathedral in front of roughly 2 billion people watching around the world. Members of staff who worked the funeral that day later said the entire congregation seemed to hold its breath as Spencer stepped toward the lectern because nobody knew exactly what a grieving brother might say with that many cameras pointed at him. And Spencer, barely more than a boy himself at the time, stepped up and swore out loud in front of everyone that his sister's sons would be raised with warmth, never crushed by the same cold institution that had broken their mother. As he spoke those words, something extraordinary happened outside the cathedral walls. Applause broke out among the crowds watching on giant screens in the streets. And it did not stay outside. It rolled inward through the open doors and landed right in the middle of the very family he was confronting, shattering centuries of royal funeral tradition in one single moment that older courtiers would later call the most awkward few minutes the monarchy had endured in living memory. And then, almost overnight, Spencer vanished. Music for 28 straight years. There were no documentaries, no tell-all memoirs, and no carefully timed interviews handed to friendly journalists. Every single film ever made about Diana had been stitched together from the exact same recycled footage the entire world already owned, because Spencer had refused every single time to hand over the real archive sitting locked inside his own home. Production companies reportedly approached him at least once a year for nearly 3 decades, and every single one of them received the same answer, delivered politely, but without exception. A handful even tried offering Spencer creative control over the final cut, hoping that might tempt him where money never had. And every single one of those offers was turned down just as fast as the rest. But there was a piece almost nobody outside the family ever learned. The piece that explained the cold fire burning behind everything Spencer had done. In the years right after their father died, Diana herself had asked Spencer for permission to use a small cottage on the family estate, and by most accounts, he was far from generous about the terms. Letters between the two of them, seen only by a handful of people close to the family, reportedly showed a relationship far more strained than the public image of devoted siblings ever suggested, including at least one exchange where Diana reportedly accused her brother of caring more about the estate's finances than about her. That detail did not make Spencer look like the hero everyone assumed he was. It made him look human. He had spent his sister's final years carrying real unresolved tension with her, the kind that never gets fixed before someone dies. And he had spent every single year since trying to make up for that failure layered on top of a darker guilt that was still waiting to surface. Because the truth was this: what everyone had just witnessed was never really about a streaming contract at all. It was the sound of 28 years of silence finally tearing apart at the seams. Music, and to understand exactly where all that pressure had come from, you need to go back and watch every single moment that built it, piece by piece, year after year, long before that proposal ever reached Spencer's music desk. The jewelry, the mirror, and the wound that never healed. It started small, the way most things in this family always did. At the wedding reception, Meghan stepped out wearing Diana's aquamarine ring, that pale blue stone that anyone who had ever followed Diana's story would recognize instantly. From where Spencer stood watching that night, it probably felt like remembrance. And maybe for one single moment, it even felt like real family. Guests who attended that reception later described Spencer as warm and relaxed that evening, even raising a glass at one point in the direction of the new couple, a detail that makes everything that followed feel even harder to reconcile. A cousin who sat near him that night recalled him remarking quietly that it was nice to see Diana's memory carried forward by someone who seemed to genuinely music care, a comment that would later sound almost painfully naive given everything that came after it. Then came the butterfly earrings, then the watch, then the bracelets. One after another, each piece surfacing at exactly the moment cameras were guaranteed to be pointed straight at her. Once was a tribute, but twice started to look suspiciously like a pattern. And every single time it happened in front of a lens. That was not an accident. That was a choice made again and again. And Spencer had clocked every single one of them, reportedly keeping a private record of dates and appearances that he later shared with no one outside his own household. The original was a desperate cry for help. The remake was a calculated launch, and that was why the comparison hit Spencer as hard as it did. To make matters even worse, there was a piece almost nobody talks about, and music changed the entire shape of the story. Years earlier, an official inquiry into the original broadcast that exploited Diana had confirmed something genuinely horrifying. The journalist behind it, Martin Basher, had paid someone to forge documents specifically designed to convince a frightened, isolated woman that everyone around her was secretly working against her, including fake bank statements built to look like proof that people close to her were being paid to spy on her. The network had known the truth and buried it for years before the public ever found out. They only admitted the full scale of the deception decades later, long after the damage to Diana's state of mind had already been done. Investigators, who later reviewed the case, said the forged documents had been crafted with enough detail that even people close to Diana at the time found them convincing, which made the manipulation all the more effective and all the more cruel. So when Spencer sat alone and watched a brand new interview echo his sister's worst moment almost exactly, he was not noticing some clever stylistic coincidence. He was watching his sister's deepest wound get repeated by people who had no idea what that wound had actually caused her. And the reason Spencer could not watch that hour as anything but an old wound being torn open again was about to become clear. There was a secret behind it, one that very few people outside his closest circle had ever heard before. And that secret explained every single decision he had made since. The vault, the guilt, and the soul they came for. Here was the part of this story that finally explained everything that came before it. According to long-standing accounts, it was Spencer himself who had first brought his sister into contact with Martin Basher, and he had no idea at the time what that introduction would actually lead to. He had introduced them through a mutual acquaintance at a time when he believed he was simply helping his sister find someone trustworthy to talk to. Spencer even reportedly vouched for Basher and told Diana she could trust him. So when the full truth about how that interview was actually engineered to exploit Diana finally surfaced years later, it hit Spencer like a bullet because it meant he had played a part, however unknowing, in one of the cruelest exploitations his sister ever endured. Just think about what that actually does to a person. You spend your whole adult life believing you exist to protect your sister. You stand inside a cathedral and promise 2 billion strangers you will shield her children. Then years later, you discover that the single most damaging moment of her entire life walked straight through a door that you yourself opened. A door you would have slammed shut without a second thought if anyone had told you what was waiting on the other side of it. So everything Spencer had done since then had been one long act of trying to make up for that failure. The sealed archives and the refusal after refusal to grant journalists access to it year after year, regardless of the money offered or the names attached to the offer. The unseen home movies reportedly including footage of Diana as a child running across the same grounds where she would later be buried. The handwritten diaries that nobody outside the immediate family had ever read, said to contain her private thoughts during some of the most difficult years of her life. Family members who have seen the diaries, by some accounts, describe them as raw and unguarded in a way nothing Diana ever said publicly came close to matching, which is exactly why Spencer has never once considered letting them leave the house. So when this new proposal landed asking for worth itself the grounds, the lake, the very island where Diana was buried, her private diaries, and home movies that had never once left the family's hands. This was not a simple business request. This was someone reaching directly for the one part of the vault that had never been shown to a single outsider. Not even visitors who paid good money just to walk the public grounds and to make the whole pitch irresistible to the people selling it. There was one more piece layered on top of all of it. They wanted to position Meghan as the modern continuation of Diana's entire story. Her halo passed formally onto someone new. An idea that reportedly excited the production team more than any other part of the pitch. And suddenly, the confrontation everyone had already witnessed made complete sense. That was never some random outburst over one bad pitch. That was 28 years of silent watching, finally given permission to speak all at once. Every single cut Spencer delivered that day had already been written inside his head for years, just waiting for the right moment to come out. And by some accounts, he had even rehearsed versions of those very lines in private, music, long before any proposal ever gave him the excuse to say them out loud. Now, here was where it got even darker. Word of exactly what happened in that room reached Meghan first before it ever reached Harry. And that single detail mattered more than people realized. Because by the time Harry finally heard what his own uncle had said and done, the entire story had already spread through production offices that had absolutely no business repeating any of it, picked up by assistants and junior staff who treated it as nothing more than gossip to pass along over lunch. So Harry never got a quiet warning. He never got the chance to manage how this would land publicly. He found out about his own humiliation exactly the same way the rest of the world did after it had already finished traveling from mouth to mouth and finally arriving on his desk as old news that everyone else seemed to already know. But to really understand why this rejection cut as deep as it did, music, you need to see exactly how much was riding on that proposal, actually music going through the war. Now is because he finally found a way to matter again by attacking the two people who never once stopped being talked about. People close to Harry later said the message took him less than 10 minutes to write, and that he sent it before anyone around him even had the chance to talk him out of it. Then Spencer made one more move that caught absolutely everyone off guard. In a quiet, discreet step, he reportedly wrote directly to William urging him to publicly address the crisis, tearing his own brother's family apart. And there was no mistaking what this actually was. This was not a peace offering. This was pure strategy. The same man who had once shaken an entire cathedral with applause decades earlier was now pushing the future king to defend the crown's image first ahead of his own nephew's feelings, reportedly warning William in that same letter that continued silence from the palace was being read by the public as weakness rather than restraint. As expected, William never publicly responded to the letter. But that single move from Spencer told everyone watching exactly how far the loyalties inside this family had shifted. Since the very man who once promised to shield Diana's sons from the institution was now actively working to protect that same institution from one of those sons. And underneath all of the noise sits the real reason none of this would heal quickly. The royal family was reportedly open to some kind of peace talks with Harry, but stayed extremely reluctant to ever fully reconcile with Meghan. And the core of that reluctance came down to one single word: trust. They were terrified that any private moments shared with her would quietly become raw material for whatever came next. A fear shared by aides across multiple departments who had grown used to treating every family interaction as something that might eventually surface in public. To make matters even worse, King Charles's own declining health music sat quietly underneath every part of this entire standoff. Because this is a family already carrying decades of grievance, now also forced to weigh exactly how much time was left to fix any of it at all. A pressure that reportedly weighed on William more than he let on to anyone outside his closest circle. Diana had once been exploited by a man armed with forged documents. But her own brother had decided she would not be exploited a second time, not even by her own blood. Not even for a streaming deal worth a fortune. So the vault at Allworth is still locked tight. And right now, the only sound echoing out from inside it is the memory of a confrontation that has already traveled.